Today we're going to take a look at my two very successful 1000 point lists to see if we can make an ultimate 2000 point Necron list. And it's coming right up.
Necrons!
Nick speaking, and welcome to this video. Right, today I'm going to make an army list, an ultimate army list from two of my very successful 1000 point lists. Now, if you know this channel quite well, you'll know that I generally don't like to play the norm, the meta. Sometimes I do, I'll admit, but not all of the time. Usually my lists are themed around a certain thing, and I have two 1000 point themed lists which I'm going to combine and adjust and adapt into an ultimate 2000 point list. I'm going to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the 1000 point lists and the tactics of how these lists work, and then adapt them into the 2000 point list. Hopefully this will be interesting in A, list building, B, in tactics, and C, in just, well, seeing how I go about doing it. Right, let's have a look at my first 1000 point list. Okay, so my first list is a Destroyer Cult themed list. Now, fingers crossed when the Codex comes out very soon that we will actually get a Destroyer Cult, a dynasty, or whatever the new words are for it. What are the new words? Detachment! That's it. Hopefully we'll get a new detachment for the Destroyer Cult. Now, at the end of 9th edition, I converted, kit-bashed a Locust Lord. I did this out of a Locust Heavy Destroyer. I was really happy with the conversion. I thought he looked really cool. However, I didn't get to play him in 9th edition. So I thought I would definitely put him on the table in 10th edition. And of course, he was my starting point for my Destroyer Cult list. Now, I know a lot of people don't like the Locust Destroyer models that we currently have, the old ones, and of course we are desperate for some new miniatures, which, well, I don't know whether we're going to get them yet, but at some point we will, because of course Games Workshop are getting rid of any miniatures that have the green rods in them. Now, personally, I like the old miniatures. I don't have an issue with them. I've been playing them for over 20 years now, so they are actually one of my favourite miniatures. So, of course, with the Locust Lord is going to be some Locust Destroyers. So that's how I started my list. The Locust Lord with, of course, the Resurrection Orb, because we don't pay for that now. And then 6 Locust Destroyers. Now, if I was taking the Locust Destroyers, the Locust Lord, of course, was going to join them. And I decided to give the Locust Lord the Hyper Material Ablator, giving the units the stealth ability and a cover save if your opponent is more than 12 inches away. Now, keeping the theme of Destroyers, I had 2 units of 3 Locust Destroyers in the list. And of course, I'm going to need some heavy support. So I went for 2 units of 3 heavy destroyers with the Gauss Destructor. I tried to fit 3 units in the list, but I couldn't. Now, I originally made this list before the current points changes. I had 2 units of 3 Scarabs and 2 units of 5 Death Marks in the list. Those are my auto-include units to help me get secondary objectives. I've made a video all about them, and I'll link that video up for you at the end of this one so you can check it out next. Now, my original list also had a single Locust Heavy Destroyer in there as well, with the Admitic Exterminator. Of course, the destroyers going up in points. My original list was 995 points. Now, after adding my 2 units of Death Marks in there and taking my unit of Scarab Swarms away, I actually had 15 points spare. So what I did, rather than having 2 units of Death Marks, is I had just 1 unit of Death Marks. And that meant I had 80 points left over, which was ideal for a Hexmark Destroyer. Taking my list to exactly 1000 points, the Hexmark Destroyer had the same job that the Death Marks would do, and that would be to deep strike, to get some secondary objectives, either engage in all fronts, deploy teleport homers behind enemy lines, those type of secondary objectives. Now, the Scarab Swarms go in my deployment zone in one corner. The idea is, of course, to block any deep strikers from coming in, getting their secondary objectives, and then to do investigate signals when that card comes up for me. Now, originally I had both corners with scarab swarms in, which of course now I can't do. So the role of the Locust Heavy Destroyer with the Exterminator gun is going to change slightly from what it was doing to be in the corner of my deployment zone, basically replacing one of the Scarab Swarm units. The 2 Heavy Destroyer units will go on my home objective, trying to kill as much as they can. My Locust Lord, of course, with the big unit of destroyers, with the Resurrection Orb, the -1 to hit, giving that unit critical hits and a 5+. Very useful, very difficult to kill actually, more difficult than you might think. The gun, of course, we know is only strength 5. However, critical hits and a 5+, of course, re-rolling 1s to hit is pretty useful. As for the other 2 small units of destroyers, they will go on the flanks and, if needed, go forward onto the central objectives. However, that isn't actually the plan with this army. This army is going to sit back for as long as possible, usually the first couple of turns. I'm very good at shooting, I've got a lot of shots. However, if I move forward, I'm going to get destroyed because, of course, I'm not that great in close combat and I don't have any counter-assault units. There's nothing in here which is really assaulty. Even the Locust Lord with his Overlord's Blade, he isn't that great in close combat. So when I'm playing this list, I do accept that primaries are going to be tough to score the first couple of turns, depending on the mission, of course. However, hopefully I can destroy enough that by turn 3, 4 and 5 come around, I'm able to push forward and grab those objectives and start scoring my primary. And so far, with all of the games that I've played with this list, I've had great success. I've won every game. Now, I suppose what you're asking is, well, how about making a 2,000 point Destroyer Cult list? Well, I did that. I actually did that and I did win that game. However, it did highlight the flaw of the list, and that is basically that, yeah, you do have to stand back most of the game, which is fine and works, but it's probably not the best tactics to say, right, I'm not going to score primary objectives the first couple of turns, I'm just going to hold back, shoot and grab them later, because, well, that's not going to win you every game. So, yeah, it was flawed. Right, let's have a look at my second 1,000 point list, again, which I've had great success with. Okay, so this list is inspired, again, by a single miniature, which is usually how I list build. I take a miniature that I want to play and I build a list around it. And this one is, well, pretty meta, to be fair, but it's the Transcendent Catan. I've seen everyone playing it, having great success with it, saying how great it is, and I hadn't played it yet, so I wanted to play the Transcendent Catan. So, first of all, in the list is the Transcendent Catan, and of course, he's got the Weave. Increased in points recently, of course, to 310 with the Sempiternal Weave, but a fantastic enhancement, and, well, we're just going to keep our fingers crossed that Games Workshop don't change that, because having that 4+ Feel No Pain on him is absolutely awesome. And of course, not only that, but he's able to teleport around the board when he advances. So, really, really useful unit, difficult to kill, pretty decent shooting, pretty decent in close combat, and definitely the linchpin of this list. So, adding to the list, and next I wanted to play Tomb Blades. I'd only played Tomb Blades once in a game. I ideally wanted to play 2 units of 6, but the list didn't develop in that way. So I ended up with 2 units of 3. I had Shadow Looms and Shield Veins on them, a 3+ save and a 5+ invulnerable save. 2 of the models had the Particle Beamer and 1 had the Twin Tester Carbine, so they could advance and still do actions. Now, talking of actions, if you draw Deploy Teleport Homers early in the game, like turn 1, if you teleport your Transcendent Catan and then deploy teleport homers on the centre objective, then of course he can't shoot, he's just got to stand there. So I wanted to stop that from happening. I want to be more aggressive with my Catan. So I wanted something which could deploy teleport homers, turn 1, income 5 flayed ones. Flayed ones, of course, can infiltrate straight onto the objective, whilst yes, I could move the tomb blades onto the centre objective. I've got another plan for them. So yeah, flayed ones, centre objective, or potentially just in a really awkward position for my opponent, maybe hiding behind a piece of terrain, making a little play on the flanks for behind enemy lines, depending on the deployment map. But effectively, they're going to infiltrate. They could potentially mess up with my opponent's infiltrating units, and they're just going to be a pain for my opponent. Yes, of course, when they get targeted, whether shot at or assaulted, they're probably going to die, but that's okay. They're there for different reasons than killing stuff. Now, of course, I'm going to need some big guns in the list, so in come 3 Locust Heavy Destroyers, and they're going to be led by a Hexmark Destroyer with the Sovereign Coronal, of course, not actually joining the unit, just leading the unit with the Aura ability. This means that I can move and, of course, still hit on 2s, or if I get a unit which I'm targeting that has -1 to hit, of course, his Aura ability is going to negate that. Pretty useful. Now, of course, this unit is going to go on my home objective and try to kill as much as it can from range. Next, I have my 2 units of death marks for the same reason that I was talking about. Fire alarm. Every Wednesday when I'm recording a video. Now, I've also got 2 units of death marks in the list to do the same job that they were doing in the previous list. Now, I tried to put 2 units of Scarab Swarms in there as well, but I was 10 points over. I tried to jiggle the list as much as I could, but I just couldn't get 2 units of Scarabs in there. So just 1 unit of Scarabs, and that meant I had 30 points left. So I decided to put a single Locust Destroyer in the list. 30 points, taking me exactly to 1,000 points. And that destroyer is going to do the same job as the Scarab Swarms, basically go in the corner of my deployment zone, block any deep strikers or reserves coming in from my enemy, and of course investigate signals when that card comes up. So in this list we've got our fixed positions infiltrating the flayed ones, the death marks in reserve, the Locust Destroyer and the Scarabs in my corners, and then the Hexmark Destroyer and the Heavy Destroyers on my home objective. The Transcendent Catan and the Tomb Blades are the only units which are free to do what I want them to do. The Transcendent Catan, of course, is going to start teleporting around the board, causing trouble for my opponent, taking my opponent's attention away from the rest of my army. The Tomb Blades start off hiding behind a piece of terrain and then come out as and when needed onto objectives. I generally run the Tomb Blades together, although sometimes I will split them up. It really depends on the mission. But once again, I haven't lost with this list. Now, this list is very good at scoring secondary objectives. It can score primary pretty well as well, although of course it's fairly fragile with those small sort of MSU units. Now, the Transcendent Catan pushes forward, causes my opponent some issues. They have to deal with him or potentially ignore him. Now, the Transcendent Catan hasn't died yet, but of course I know he is killable. I mean, you know, one day he will go down. And if he does, then maybe the rest of my army is going to be very vulnerable. However, I haven't lost too many units from this army, and it's performed incredibly well. So that's where I got the idea to take these 2 very different lists and make an ultimate list where I think I can whittle out the weaknesses of both lists and maybe have a really strong non-meta list. Okay, Transcendent Catan maybe is meta, but there's no warriors, there's no reanimators, there's no Lich Guard, no Cryptothralls, no Technomancer. You know what I mean. Okay, so let's have a look at these 2 lists and see if we can combine them and make an ultimate Necron list. We're going to start with the Destroyer side of things. So my Locust Lord is going to be in the list. He's going to be armed exactly the same, and he's going to be leading a unit of Locust Destroyers, a big unit of 6. Now I'm going to keep the 2 small units of Locust Destroyers. When I upgraded the Destroyer list before, they became 2 units of 6. But of course, I need to make points for the rest of the stuff, and 2 units of 3 actually work quite well. Now, one thing about my list, apart from the Transcendent Catan, who of course is a monster, is I don't give up Bring It Down very easily, especially the Destroyer list. And that's one reason why I like to put the Locust Heavy Destroyers in as my heavy support. So that isn't going to change. I'm going to take the 2 units of Locust Heavy Destroyers from my Destroyer list, and I'm going to take the single unit from the Transcendent Catan list to give me 3 units of Locust Heavy Destroyers. They're going to operate in my backfield, of course, killing as much as they can, and I'm going to lead them with the Sovereign Coronal Hexmark Destroyer from the Transcendent Catan list. That aura ability is really useful. Right, next up it's my auto-include units, 2 units of Death Marks, 2 units of 3 Scarab Swarms. We're then on to my Transcendent Catan half of the list, and of course the Transcendent Catan with the Weave is going to be in the list. We're then going to have a look at the Tomb Blades. Now originally I said I wanted 2 units of 6, and I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to increase the unit size to 6 for each of those because it just makes them a lot more survivable. It means that when I go out to objectives, if I can use terrain well, then hopefully I'm going to be able to survive a lot more than a unit of 3. And then finally from the Transcendent Catan list is a unit of Flayed Ones. Now I had 5 in my original list, so I wanted to up that to a unit of 10, which I did. However, that took me to 2,005 points. And this is the one thing which I really hate about 10th edition. Overall, I love it. I think it's fantastic, and I do find list building a lot easier in 10th edition. However, I do have quite a big issue with this. I'm looking at my computer because that's where my notes are. But yeah, I'm 5 points over, and in the old days it'd be, okay, just drop a Flayed One. There you go. Under 2,000 points. However, I've got to make some really big changes to this list just to lose that 5 points, down to the fact of how list building works in 10th edition. And it's really annoying. Now I really want those Flayed Ones in the list. It's part and parcel of how the Transcendent Catan side of the list works. Now I could free up some points from maybe dropping a Destroyer, one of the Destroyers on the units of 3. However, I think that compromises the unit quite a lot. I could drop a Heavy Destroyer, but again, I think it compromises those units. Now the Flayed Ones can do the same job whether they're a unit of 5 or 10. Obviously, if they're a unit of 10, they are a lot more durable. Potentially, I could take 2 units of 5 Flayed Ones if I wanted to. However, as I said, I've got a points issue. So I'm going to reduce the size of the 10-man unit down to 5. So 5 Flayed Ones. And that gives me 65 points left. And I went through all of the index, how I could spend that 65 points. And the only feasible option that I could come up with that suits this list is another unit of Death Marks. Not ideal. I really would love to have either 2 units of Flayed Ones or 1 big unit of 10 Flayed Ones. But I think Death Marks could work in the list, because an issue sometimes with the Death Marks is, of course, when they come down in either turn 2 or 3, maybe to score, let's say, behind enemy lines. Once they're down, they're sort of locked there where they are. And of course, yes, I could use Ophidian Destroyers, maybe to sort of jump around, but I've got the Transcendent Catan to do that. Ooh, I've just had a thought. Ophidian Destroyers, how many points are they? Okay, so 100 points, so I could drop my 2 units of Death Marks, maybe put the Ophidian Destroyers in there instead, but that leaves me with 30 points to spend, and that's going to be hard to spend on this list. Plus, the Ophidians weren't in my 2 original lists, and the whole idea of this is to combine those 2 lists. So it's back to 3 units of Death Marks. So that's my final list, 2,000 points. I'm going to use all of the Destroyer units at the back of my army, around my deployment zone, around my home objectives, and they're going to shoot as much as they can. The Transcendent Catan is just going to go out and just distract and do whatever damage it can and score points as well, of course. And then the 3 units of Death Marks are going to go in reserve and they're going to do secondary objectives. My 2 units of Scarabs are going to go in the corners of my deployment zone to block my opponent and then do the investigate signals when that comes up. My flayed ones are going to infiltrate just to be pesky and annoying and potentially get a secondary objective in turn 1. And then my 2 units of Tomb Blades are just going to push forward onto central objectives. I think this list has a lot of potential to do A, a lot of damage, and B, to score very well with primary and secondary mission objectives. But I'd love to know what you think. Let me know in the comments box below. And if you want to see the tactical video I was talking about earlier, here it is. And here's a playlist of all of the other tactical videos that I've made.